isn't going back because he thinks, oh, I violated the armistice. He's going back because he could be a target.
Fire and fury, like the world has never seen.
Other top story tonight, the growing showdown between the U.S. and North Korea.
Tonight, the heavily fortified border, the DMZ, is on a razor's edge.
The entire U.S. mainland is within the range of our nuclear strike, and the button is always on the table in my office.
North Korea is believed to have masterminded the bloody blasts of landmines in the demilitarized zone.
I'm so glad at last there's peace in Korea. Yes.
For the past 60 years, there has been an extreme amount of tension across the Korean peninsula. The root of this conflict came from the signing of a rushed armistice to end the Korean War. Before the war, conflict in Korea had been present for years. Ever since the defeat of Japan in World War II, the peninsula had been divided into two separate countries, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, and the Republic of Korea, or South Korea. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea was a communist government and heavily influenced by their neighbors, China and the Soviet Union. The Republic of Korea, however, was a capitalist society. This difference in ideology led to tension between the two. While that conflict occurred, the Cold War was in full swing. The United States was attempting to fight against the spread of communism, specifically from the Soviet Union. So in an effort to halt the progression of another communist superpower, the United States supported the Republic of Korea. Around the same time, Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, was talking to other communist governments like the Soviet Union. Much like their Western counterparts, the Soviets were attempting to gain the upper hand in the Cold War, and having a communist power emerging would have been beneficial for their cause. This tension between the two nations came to a front in May of 1950 when the Democratic People's Republic of Korea invaded the Republic of Korea with the aid of the Chinese and Soviets. In response, the United Nations sent troops to the Republic of Korea. After the United Nations sent their troops in, they would push the North's forces up to the Yalu River, which divided the peninsula from China. In response to their border being threatened, the Chinese pushed the UN forces back. In 1951, the Republic of Korea forced the Democratic People's Republic of Korea back to the 38th parallel. Fighting in that area would become a stalemate until 1953. With no victor in sight, both sides agreed to sign an armistice. The original intention of the armistice was to halt the war for the time being and then to create a formal peace treaty in the United Nations. However, talks in the United Nations were unsuccessful, leaving the armistice as the only formal declaration between the two. The armistice had 5 articles. The first article established a 2.5-mile wide demilitarized zone that stretched from either end of Korea. The second article discusses the terms of the ceasefire. It also established the Military Armistice Commission, a neutral group designated to resolving conflicts between the North and South based off of the terms of the armistice. The third article of the armistice discussed the transfer of prisoners of war. The fourth article advised the two nations to resolve all conflicts quickly and diplomatically. The fifth and final article discusses miscellaneous issues such as the revision of the armistice and when it would become effective.
And they just argued and argued and argued for days. Then they finally agreed that it would be set around the 38th parallel.
Although the armistice ended the immediate conflict between the North and South, the tension between the countries was still present. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, known as North Korea, resented the divided Korea. The Republic of Korea, known as South Korea, also resented not being one unified country. The creation of the armistice had done nothing to further resolve the tension between the North and South by not addressing their desire for a unified Korea. A report sent to a Soviet ambassador talking about the South Koreans stated, although a representative of the South Korean army was included in the delegation to conduct negotiations at the instructions of the Americans, the Syngman Rhee government did not stop opposing an armistice. On the 31st of July, it organized a mass demonstration under the slogan, "Unification or Death." The tension between the two countries increased due to both believing they should unify under their own leader's rule. This tension had been the driving force for all conflict between the two countries since the end of the war. Although there had been no formal warfare between the two countries, there was still extreme amounts of social and political tension that was not solved by the armistice. Both sides of the conflict compromised in order to form the armistice. While the end of a needless war was beneficial for both sides, neither side was able to achieve their main goal of of total control over Korea. However, the armistice cannot be considered a complete failure due to the lack of formal warfare between the countries. There has been no shortage of conflict between the two nations since the signing of the armistice. Between 1966 and 1969, the North and South had several small skirmishes along the DMZ. This was referred to as the Korean DMZ conflict, and about 700 soldiers from both the North and South were killed as a part of it. The most notable example of conflict during this period was during the Blue House Raid. In 1968, 31 hand-picked soldiers were under direct orders from Kim Il-sung to assassinate South Korean President Park Chung-hee. The goal was to throw his head into the streets of Seoul. The raid ultimately ended in a shootout between the North Korean assassins and South Korean forces with the aid of US troops. After the fight, only 2 attackers survived, one escaping and the other was captured. The armistice specified that there would be a meeting place for the North and South to continue talks. That meeting place would become the Joint Security Area.
There's both North Korean and South Korean troops that are stationed there, and they are about 10-15 feet apart, sitting across from one another. So it's pretty intimidating for the soldiers.
This area would become a place of great tension. On August 18th, 1976, several United Nations soldiers tried to chop down a tree blocking their view.
But there was a time when one of our captains went over to remove a tree which was blocking the view, and the North Korean guards jumped him and beat him to death.
The North Korean soldiers claimed that the tree was planted by Kim Jong-il himself, and they had to prevent UN soldiers from chopping it down. The armistice was ultimately ineffective due to both sides either ignoring it or denouncing it. There are numerous examples of both the North and South completely ignoring the armistice limitations on the number of troops allowed into the DMZ. One of the most outrageous examples of this came during the Korean DMZ conflict, where both sides violated clauses limiting the number of armed soldiers inside of the DMZ. One example of the partial denunciation of the armistice agreement was in paragraph 13D. In this section, it was stated that no new weapons were allowed inside Korea, an effort to halt atomic warfare in the peninsula. However, in 1956, South Korea, in accordance with the United States, repealed this section and began to import nuclear weapons into their country. North Korea has also committed similar behaviors. In fact, the North denounced the entirety of the armistice 6 separate times. This occurred in 1994, 1996, 2003, 2006, 2009, and 2013. The majority of these denunciations came due to South Korean involvement with the United States. However, there has been some relative peace between the two nations. In the year 2000, the two nations met to discuss economic cooperation and the reuniting of families separated by the DMZ. In 2007, there was a summit at which the leaders of North and South Korea shook hands. They discussed setting aside political and ideological differences for the betterment of the two nations. The relationship between the North and South seems to be getting better. For example, in 2018, delegates from both North and South Korea met inside the JSA for the first time in 3 years. They spoke about inter-Korean relations, which is a promising start to further peace talks. Another source of possible peace is a rather unlikely one, the DMZ. Currently, the DMZ is atmospherically different from its origin.
Believe it or not, the DMZ today is kind of like a tourist destination. They offer a lot of tours to visit the DMZ almost on a weekly basis. You might have to have a background check and maybe some association with the Army. But it's pretty easy to actually visit the DMZ.
Historically, the DMZ can be viewed as both a physical and metaphorical boundary between the two nations. According to photographer David Gudenfelder, who has traveled and documented his experiences at the DMZ several times, the division is more than a physical boundary. It limits imagination and empathy and connection. However, Gudenfelder believes that the tourism of the DMZ could be a possible solution to tensions between the two countries, stating that a lot of people use the DMZ as a positive place. It's become way more than just a border. It's operating in this very big, symbolic way, both good and bad. Through tourism, civilians of both sides can understand each other more. They can defy stereotypes about each other and view each other as humans, which is the most important part of creating peace in that area. Through the history of the divided Koreas, there has only been one constant: tension. Through this omnipresent tension, the Korean War Armistice failed as a means to end the conflict between the North and South. However, there is still hope that one day there will be peace.
I'm so glad at last there's peace in Korea. Korea. Yes, I'm so glad at last there's peace in Korea. Don't you know, I'm so glad at last there's peace in Korea, because President Eisenhower has done